For over 50 years, the United States has had a trade embargo on a simple, harmless country. I'm talking about the Cuban embargo. So today, we're going to be talking about the history of the embargo, then we will discuss what it's like today, and finally see where the future of it is headed. Let's first look at the history. In 1962, the United States placed a trade embargo on the country of Cuba. Specifically, we saw this in the Cold War era. Russia and Cuba were working together against the United States. So, the United States took action, being that Cuba is only 90 miles off the United States coast. We put protection on ourselves by placing a trade embargo on them. Specifically, we saw this as a way to deter their country from causing any harm to the United States due to the fact that they could not trade with us or get any goods or services. Since then, we have seen that there has been no trade from the United States and Cuba up until 1989. Specifically, then, we had to lift the trade embargo to help with food and medicine situations inside of Cuba due to the fact that they were suffering because of their government. According to a 2011 article by Yoani Sanchez in the Davis Institute for National Security at the Heritage Foundation, she states that the biggest problem in Cuba is the government-inflicted issues. Due to the fact that the Raul Castro dictatorship has been going on for centuries, we can see that this has caused many problems in Cuba over the years. And specifically, with the Cuban embargo in place, it's only caused more harm to the Cuban citizens. This is where we lead to my second point, which talks about what Cuba is like currently. We can look to the status of the Cuban people. An average Cuban only makes around $20 a month. Then they spend 60 to 80% of their wages only on food, leaving at least 40 to 20% on everything else that they need for essential things. Now we can also look to the water and wastewater systems inside of Cuba. They lack adequate sanitation and they don't have access to clean water. There are over 62% of Cubans that don't have access to clean water. This leads to many more human rights violations that we're seeing happening inside of Cuba right now due to the fact that the government won't take care of the Cuban people and the United States can't help due to the fact that we have the Cuban trade embargo in place. And then this leads to the tourism. They have tourism from 169 other countries that they're possibly able to trade with. In an article titled Cuba's Surge in Tourism, Azam Ahmed from the New York Times in 2016 says that there are over 3.5 million tourists visiting Cuba each year. Thus, this leads to sex trafficking. We can see that Cubans only make $20 a month. So sex trafficking has gone up in Cuba, being that the Cuban people can become a prostitute at the age of 16. Most Cubans are willing to do these sexual acts for other people due to the fact that they can make easy money that is more than the wage they make per month. This is leading to a lot more human rights violations, and it's degrading people inside of Cuba. So finally, let's talk about the future of this. Why have we kept this embargo in place when it really has no meaning anymore since we are out of the Cold War era? In the status quo, we're moving towards relations with Cuba, but we're uncertain if we will ever actually lift the Cuban embargo. The reasons for leaving it in place would be the fact that the government still has not fixed its ways or worked towards these human rights violations. In a 2011 article by Richard Feinberg from the Brookings Institution, he states, quote, that Cuba's current leadership has promulgated reform guidelines and that recognizes imperative of change that empower the pro-reform factions. This means that we're moving towards reforms in the status quo and working on bettering relations, but it's still unclear if we will ever lift the embargo or when we actually will to help the Cuban people and to give them the things that they need. For over 50 years, we have had this embargo in this country, and so far it's only caused more harm to Cuban citizens. It hasn't served its purpose, and the United States has never been harmed by Cuba. So therefore, we can see that the Cuban embargo, it holds a purpose of the government, but it also doesn't hold a purpose anymore due to the fact that the Cold War is over. Today, we talked about the history of the embargo, what it's like today, and where the future is headed. We're uncertain of what will happen, but we can see that the Cuban embargo has done what it has done, and it will continue to do whether we lift it or not.